As we get started with our teaching time today, we had a special request from one of our elders to do God Bless America, and I think it's appropriate this time of year. We just celebrated the anniversary of our independence, so this song is very appropriate, and it's entitled God Bless America, but I want to give a little story behind it before we sing. This is a story behind God Bless America. This simple one-verse song became an overnight hit and a hopeful song as war threatened. It's not a patriotic song, composer Irving Berlin said in a 1940 interview, but an expression of gratitude for what this country has done for its citizens, of what home really means. Today, many Americans consider God Bless America an unofficial national anthem of the United States. Irving Berlin, born in 1888 and died in 1989, 101 years old. The life of Irving Berlin is a uniquely American success story. He was born Israel Belin in the Jewish village of Tyumen in a harsh region of Russia known as Siberia. When he was about 5, an anti-Jewish mob destroyed his family's home, and the Belins set out for America. They settled on New York's Lower East Side. Irving Berlin's father died when he was 8, and Izzy, as he was known, went to work selling newspapers to help support his family. As a young teen, he began singing in saloons and at some point taught himself piano. He began copying the musical styles of the day and developed an incredible instinct for creating popular tunes that people really loved to sing. A printing error on a published piece of sheet music left him with the name Irving Berlin. And that was the name that he carried as he wrote song after song. In 1911, he wrote his first huge dance hit entitled Alexander's Ragtime Band. After that, Berlin's career took off like a rocket. He wrote stage musicals and film scores and produced hit after hit. Many are still sung today, including White Christmas, Blue Skies, Always, There's No Business Like Show Business, Heat Wave, I've Got My Love to Keep Me Warm, and God Bless America, among many others. When describing his goal as a songwriter, Berlin said, "My ambition is to reach the heart of the average American, that vast intermediate crew, which is the real soul of the country. My public is the real people," he said. Kate Smith, one of the great singers of her day, had asked for a new number for her radio show. The year was 1938. She was looking for something fresh to mark the 20th anniversary of the end of the Great War, which would later be called World War I. Irving Berlin had composer's block. Berlin felt the urgency to deliver. He had recently returned from Europe where catastrophe was brewing. Nazi Germany, led by Adolf Hitler, was growing more powerful and aggressive and seemed to be preparing for war. But Berlin wasn't focused on writing a Get America Ready for War song. He wanted to create something to celebrate America as a special place to live. Then he remembered a song that he had drafted many years earlier. So he pulled out an old trunk and dusted off a 20-year-old manuscript, reviving and revising a forgotten song that he had written back in 1918 when the then Sergeant Irving Berlin was stationed at Camp Upton in Yaphank on Long Island, New York. At the time, Berlin was already a successful songwriter. Now a draftee into the Army during World War I, and his commanding officer enlisted him to write a musical review to help raise money for a new building. One of the songs Berlin had written for that review had been cut from the show because, in his words, the lyrics were too sappy. So God Bless America waited in that trunk for the next 2 decades. Then Kate Smith came calling. Now Berlin looked over his earlier work and rapidly began rewriting and revising. He had less than 2 weeks to get it ready for her performance. The result was the song most American school kids have learned by heart ever since. God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her through the night with a light from above. From the mountains to the prairies, to the ocean white with foam, God bless America, my home, sweet home. Smith sang the song as the show closer on her live national broadcast that night. Berlin's phone immediately began ringing off the hook. Everyone wanted to know where they could get the music. And after that, Smith almost always included the song in her weekly show, and it became her trademark during a career that spanned 5 decades. She also added a short poem prelude that Berlin had also written, and it goes like this. While the storm clouds gather far across the sea, let us swear allegiance to a land that's free. Let us all be grateful for a land so fair as we raise our voices in solemn prayer. Storm clouds were indeed gathering over Europe. Less than a year after the debut of God Bless America, Germany's war machine rolled into Poland, igniting World War II in Europe. The Japanese had already invaded China 2 years earlier, beginning the war in Asia. The United States would not officially join the war until the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December the 7th, 1941. But as God Bless America grew in popularity, most Americans already feared that it was just a matter of time before the U.S. would be called to fight. During World War II, Berlin toured with his show called This is the Army to raise money for the U.S. war effort. God Bless America was one of the featured songs. When it came to God Bless America, Irving Berlin and Kate Smith put their money where their mouths were. They donated all the royalties from the hit song to the Boy and Girl Scouts of America through the God Bless America Foundation. That arrangement is still in effect today. Other wartime songs would remind Americans what they were fighting against. Berlin's God Bless America reminded them what they were fighting for. I thought that was so appropriate. Now, if you would stand and we'll sing God Bless America, if your brother can get it right. God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her through the night with a light from above. From the mountains to the prairies, to the oceans white with foam. God bless America, my home, sweet home. God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her through the night with a light from above. From the mountains to the prairies, to the oceans white with foam. God bless America, my home, sweet home. God bless America, my home, sweet home.
Now, as we go to our classes, we'll also move to our study of Isaiah. We're in Isaiah 5, beginning at verse 8. We're going to not make it through verse 25, but we're going to get started. And that'll be our next section. So we'll get us, first of all, we'll start recording. And then get back to our notes. All right. So he's dealing with a unruly people, not the enemy here, but his own people, Israel. Woe to those who add house to house and join field to field until there is no more room, so that you have to live alone in the midst of the land. In my ears, Adonai Sabaoth has sworn, surely many houses shall become desolate, even great and fine ones without occupants. For 10 acres of vineyard will yield only one bath of wine. A homer of seed will yield but an ephah of grain. Woe to those who rise early in the morning that they may pursue strong drink, who stay up late in the evening that wine may inflame them. Their banquets are accompanied by lyre and harp, by tambourine and flute, and by wine. But they do not pay attention to the deeds of Adonai, nor do they consider the work of his hands. Therefore my people go into exile for the lack of knowledge, and their honorable men are famished, and their multitude is parched with thirst. Therefore Sheol has enlarged its throat and opened its mouth without measure. And Jerusalem's splendor, her multitude, her den of revelry, and the jubilant within her descend into it. So the common man will be humbled, and the man of importance abased. The eyes of the proud also will be abased. But Adonai Sabaoth will be exalted in judgment, and the holy ones will show himself holy in righteousness. and the holy God will show himself holy in righteousness. Then the lambs will graze as in their pasture, and strangers will eat in the waste places of the wealthy. Woe to those who drag iniquity with the cords of falsehood, and sin as if with cart ropes, who say, let him make speed, let him hasten his work, that we may see it. Let the purpose of the Holy One of Israel draw near, and come to pass that we may know it. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who substitute darkness for light and light for darkness, who substitute bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and clever in their own sight. Woe to those who are heroes in drinking wine and valiant men in mixing strong drink, who justify the wicked for a bribe and take away the rights of the ones who are in the right. Therefore as a tongue of fire consumes stubble, and dry grass collapses into the flame, so their root will become like rot, and their blossom blow away as dust. For they have rejected the Torah of Adonai Sebaot, and despised the word of the Holy One of Israel. On this account, the anger of Adonai has burned against his people. He stretched out his hand against them and struck them down. As the mountains quaked, and their corpses lay like refuse in the middle of the streets. For all this, his anger is not spent, but his hand is still stretched out. Or as we would read in the King James, his anger is stretched out still. And so this passage, coming as it does on the heels of that beautiful little poem about how God prepared a vineyard and planted a choice vine. We have these woes. This is what he actually found. Instead of good grapes, this is what he found. So these 6 woes that follow, what he told us in Isaiah 5, 1 through 7, the parable of the vineyard, these woes describes what the wild grapes were actually like. And so God created a perfect vineyard, provided it might bear fruit. But this is what he actually received. So there are 6 woes. Some list 5, others 6, but there's 6 times we find the word hoi, or woe is me, woe, in our text. So we're going to go with 6 of them. And so the Hebrew hoi, it appears the first sentence, the first of each sentence, when it appears in our text, sets it off as a separate woe. So much like Jeremiah, Isaiah expresses both anger with a denunciation of their sin, followed by expression of sorrow over the sins of his people. And twice this list of woes is interrupted with the word therefore, which introduces a judgment associated with the woe. So most of the scholars associate the time period with the time of Uzziah in Judah and Jeroboam II in Israel, both of which enjoyed significant growth and prosperity, which led to the spiritual bankruptcy. So the greatest threat, the reason why America is so soft is because of our prosperity. Prosperity tends to kill the power of faith and the power and strength of a congregation. And so the people had turned to a life of selfish indulgence and pleasure, which was what happens when you become well-off or opulent. And so this prosperity came to an end, according to a lot of these scholars, during the rise to power of the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser III. So that was the formation of the downfall, so to speak, is their prosperity. And so we'll begin here with verse 8 through 10. Woe unto those who add house to house and join field to field until there's no more room, so that you have to live alone in the midst of the land. In my ears Adonai Sebaot has sworn, surely many houses will become desolate, even great and fine ones without occupants. For 10 acres of vineyard will yield only 1 bath of wine, and a homer of seed will yield but an ephah of grain. And so this first woe has been characterized as an expression of the greed of Judah. And so there were those who had accumulated large cultivated estates, having added house to house and field to field till there's no more room, and they live alone in the midst of the land. And he's dispossessed families and homes and children. And so they kept on acquiring neighboring property until they were by themselves. And we'd understand then no more room, meaning there was no more room for those that they had displaced. And they had to move into the towns and cities to somehow eke out a living as best they could, or throw themselves on the welfare of the ones who had. And this was all in direct violation of the Torah. Because after all, what the Torah taught was the land is God's land. And he's going to let them take possession of it as stewards. And in stewards, they were to give the very first of their crops to God in respect of God's land and respect of his providing the former and latter rains, so the fertility was there, and he was going to bless their land, and they were going to have bumper crops, and they would always be in good stead. But it was God's land, and it was never supposed to be taken away from a family or tribe. It was supposed to stay in the mishpachah, or the mishpachot of a given tribe, and was not supposed to go to some other tribe or some other family within that tribe. It was supposed to be theirs in perpetuity, at least until the Lord came back. But they were stewards, and they would work the land in for its harvest of crops for survival. The whole process in order to teach them about the provisions of God and his loving care for them. The land, tribal inheritance, but only remained God's, not dispose of it. So in extreme circumstances, when the land or an individual within the tribes were sold off in order to recoup their losses, if they overextended themselves or some other means they got in a heavy debt, they were to be restored out of their slavery to their families, and the land bought back, especially the land, in a time period that was appropriate. The slaves were to be set free every 7th year in the Shemitah, and the land returned to its rightful owner every 50th year in the Jubilee. And this passage indicates the opposite, where people were being taken advantage of, their land removed from them. The final commandment in the 10 words is, thou shalt not covet. Not covet thy neighbor's wife or his donkey or his lambs or his land or his home or any of that. So don't covet. It was akin to idolatry, placing ultimate value in the present world and having things. And then verse 9 begins with an assertion that he says, in my ears, Adonai Sevaot. He doesn't say, in my ear, God has spoken, but that's the impetus we get here. He just says, in my ears is Adonai Sevaot. This is from God. This isn't me. And so a declaration of a clear word that God gave to Isaiah for Judah. The word which Isaiah received concerned the fate of the rich landowners. And he said, many houses shall become desolate, even great and fine ones. So we have the picture of buying up smaller properties, raising them to ground, erecting many large and exquisite structures in their place, and these newer, larger, and finer homes would also become desolate and judgment from God. So the phrase great and fine ones, the typical words for great and good, gadol and tov. Our verse then describes great estates that have become desolate without anyone living there, no inhabitants. And how this came to pass is described in verse 10. And so verse 10, let me go back to verse 10. For 10 acres of vineyard will yield only 1 bath of wine, and a homer seed will yield but an ephah of grain. So what he's describing for us is like a famine, greatly reduced. There's not enough being produced to take care of everybody. So crop failure leads to famine, which in turn leads to depopulation. And the first line is difficult, for it seems to say 10 teams of vineyards will make 1 bath. And so the word typically means team, is typically understood to represent a yoke of oxen. Typically in those days they would have yoked oxen together. In America we used mules and back in the day, but they would have yoked oxen together to plow in those times. And so they're trying to give us a picture of how large a piece of land this vineyard is made in. So what 10 yoke of oxen could plow in a day, that's the size of the vineyard. Seems to be the idea behind it. Don't know how much land that would be, but it's meaning a very large piece of ground. And so the two concepts seem to be disjointed in my own ears. The idea of plowing would be better suited to planting grain and growing grain, but the specific word for vineyard is being used along with a wet measure. So how much land is determined by the number of yokes of oxen, and then you've got a vineyard which produces a bath. So a bath is a wet measure. And it's equal to the dry measure we're going to be looking at too, but this is a wet measure. And so the picture of a very large vineyard, and the word wine doesn't appear, but the word bath suggests the produce of a vineyard producing grape juice and then wine. So a bath is roughly 8 gallons. Of course, there's a lot of differences. A lot of the scholars make anywhere from about 4.5 to up to 10 gallons. but a very minimal production for a very large vineyard. And so if you've ever seen pictures of one of the better vineyards in the land of Israel today, I mean, they produce a cluster of grapes bigger than I am tall. Yes. And so you can see these enormous clusters of grapes, particularly that's supposed to come from Mount Hebron. And grapes, I mean, they're big grapes, very large grapes. And the next statement is just as bad. A homer of seed will make an ephah of grain. A homer was 10 ephahs, 6 bushels of seed, but they would produce only an ephah, about 3 pecks of grain. So that's like planting a kernel of corn and getting a kernel of corn back, rather than getting an ear or several ears off a plant. So they would, a homer, they'd plant 10 ephahs, and they'd only get an ephah of grain out of it. So most of us, we're not used to use these terms today. I remember the use of terms of pecks and bushels and those kind of things when I was a kid growing up, but we don't use those things anymore. The bottom line is God's word has been violated. They treated the ground as if it were their own benefit, to benefit them and only them and not their neighbor and not God. And so God took away its productivity. Or as Oswald said, God removed its capacity to bless them because they abused the land, they abused their neighbors, they abused the Torah, they ignored the Torah, and they abused the other people and the land itself. And the actual measurements are presented differently by some scholars I've already mentioned. So from Dr. Watts, Ahmed, a measure is a land of one span of oxen can plow in 1 day, or about 2,000 square meters. A bath is a liquid measurement of 21 to 23 liters, or 5.5 gallons. So before we said 8, here's 5.5, which equals an ephah of 3/8 to 2/3 of a bushel. And so suggests that 6 1/4 acres of land would produce 2/3 of a bushel of grapes. So 6 1/4 acres of land should produce a lot more than a bushel of grapes. And the main point's clear enough. Very large vineyard produces a paltry amount of wine, and sowing vast amounts of seed produces very little grain. Both together represent a partial famine, not enough to survive. And then verses 11 and 12 says, furthermore, this is what they are described like. Woe. Here's the second woe. Woe to those who rise early in the morning that may pursue strong drink, who stay up late in the evening that wine may inflame them. Now, we don't typically think of wine as being real strong, but we use first the word for strong drink, sakar, and then the word for regular wine. But they pursue the strong, and they get inflamed at night. Their banquets are accompanied by lyre and harp, by tambourine and flute, and by wine. They do not pay attention to the deeds of Adonai, nor do they consider the work of his hands. So they're going from party to party, so to speak. So it has to do with an intoxicated lifestyle. It's unfortunate when we realize that we all have issues in some of our families. So in my families, I've had professional drunks. I had an uncle and a cousin, both drank themselves to death by the time they were 50. And they kept a full-time job while staying a constant alcoholic, drinking every single day. Knew another gentleman who married into my extended family down in Florida, and he was a professional alcoholic, drink a case of beer a day and never lose any time on his job and continue to make progress in his job. But he stayed drunk. Case of beer a day. And so this is the idea that we're getting here in our text. So often we find that to be true of those who seek out pleasure above all things. And so we read about those wealthy people in Hollywood that stay drunk 90% of the time and hard to get along with. So, we haven't changed much in America from what he's saying about Israel at this time. So from early morning to late in the evening. And so we have this time frame. And I always enjoy thinking about the time frame. Boker, which comes, and this is from Kaladesh, Boker comes from bakar, bakara, to slit, to tear up or split. So meaning the break of day, when the sun splits the sky and the day begins to dawn. So Boker meaning from the early part of the day. And Neshef, not Nephish, but Neshef, from Nashaf, to blow, the cool of the evening, so a time when the evening breeze begins to blow is the idea, including the night. And then this word echir, to continue till late, is in Proverbs. 23:30. So continue to drink even later. So the typical translation of Neshef is twilight. And twilight means the sun is set. And I love to be out on my ridge where I live, because when that sun goes down behind the tree line, and you don't see the sun anymore, but you still see the light in the atmosphere above the tree line. It's getting kind of dark to even see wildlife going into the trees below, because it's already getting dark in there. But that's twilight. So the sun's set, but full dark hadn't yet come, because there's still light in the atmosphere. That's twilight. And so this is the depiction of time from the beginning of day to the end of day. They're going after alcohol. And so we'd understand the late afternoon. It takes about the mid to late August before you don't feel the breeze out at my place in the late afternoons. And we have two words used in tandem, one for strong drink, shechar, and the second one typically used of wine, yayin. So shechar, from Kalandish again, in connection with yayin, is the general name for every other kind of strong drink, more especially for wines made artificially from fruit, honey, raisins, dates, etc., including barley wine or beer. Beer is an ancient product. We think about mead from the Isles of Great Britain, but beer. And so this has been very well documented. A beverage known in Egypt, which was half a wine country and half a beer country, from as far back as the time of the pharaohs. And so the form shechar is composed like enav, with a four-tone terse with shechar, to intoxicate. According to Arabic, literally to close by stopping up, to stupefy. So to intoxicate. So the word shechar basically comes from the concept of becoming intoxicated, which is the main point of this. But it's interesting to think about a country whose half of its people drink beer and the other half drink wine. But in connection with the early morning, they rise up in pursuit of strong drink. In connection with the evening, they stay up in order that the wine might cause them to burn, or be, the literal word says to burn or be set on fire. And so you're getting that feeling that comes when you've drank enough wine to actually have it affect the way your body reacts to it. Slows your senses, slurs the tongue, different kinds of things that happen. So whether this refers to the bite of the taste or rather the resultant feeling after much had been drunk, it seems that they were drinking for the effect which it brings. And so the basic idea behind the word shechar for strong drink is to intoxicate, and the pursuit of the state then of intoxication. The scriptures nowhere says thou shalt not drink, but we find a lot of references thou shalt not be drunk. So drunkenness is something that's condemned. But using wine, using alcoholic beverage, is not something that the Bible says thou shalt not do. But Buxbazen says the constant imbibing and carousing so dulled at their moral and spiritual sensibilities that they no longer gave any thought to God, nor his mysterious weaving of the strands of history, which will in the end completely obliterate all their pomp and glory. So in other words, they think that they can just party without any consequence. And they live for the drink. They live for the party. And so we get this idea of ongoing feasts, banquets, best understood here as regular parties going on in which their focus is on themselves to the exclusion of the things of God, and music a very big part of it. And so you see depicted in TV shows and sometimes movies, block parties. They get loud, they get rambunctious, they get boisterous because they're playing the music loud and they're drinking a lot. And that's the kind of picture we have here in our text. So like the block parties, focus on pleasure and fun. Don't care what anybody else says. Don't care what it does to them. Only care about our having our fun is the idea. And then verses 13 and 14. Therefore, because of these two woes, therefore my people go into exile for their lack of knowledge, and their honorable men are famished, and their multitude is parched with thirst. Therefore Sheol has enlarged its throat and opened its mouth without measure, and Jerusalem's splendor, her multitude, her den of revelry, and the jubilant within her descend into it. I didn't put it in my notes, but I can't help, every time I read that, I think of Korach, who rebelled against God, rebelled against Moses, and he said, Moses said to him, we'll let God decide who's his and who ain't. And the next day the earth opened its mouth, and they were swallowed whole and alive down in Sheol. And that seems to be the kind of thing that it's describing for us here. So our first therefore, introducing a judgment because of their lifestyle, and presents a logical result of turning away from God, not heeding the guidelines of the Torah. And our text literally says they go into exile because of their lack of knowledge, lack of knowing. And so the literal Hebrew, from without knowledge, they go into exile because they don't know God. Two possible aspects of this lack of knowledge. I think probably both are insinuated here. There's a lack of full knowledge and discernment of the Torah and how to effectively live out that Torah. We know that because they're ignoring their responsibilities to their fellow man. They're buying up property and evicting people off their property and don't care what happens to them. And so they're not living out Torah. And their focus is on their own pompous possessions and their affluence. And so their opulence, they're not worried about God and they're not worried about people. They're worried about themselves. And so that's, I think, fairly clear in the way this has been written for us. And so instead of caring for one another, they've used, abused, and displaced the lesser of the kingdom, taking away their property and houses, and reveling all the time in their own grandeur. And so some suggest they lack experiential knowledge of God and what God is doing in the world, which obviously that's the case. And it was always supposed to be experiential knowledge. We're to love the Lord our God with all our heart and soul and mind and strength. Circumcise our hearts and come to know God, to know Him. And so they seem to lack a true knowledge of justice, righteousness, and love for their fellow man. And secondly, they seem to be unaware, impervious to the fact that God's going to judge this. God's word is true, and He's going to judge sin. So they seem to be unaware. They're walking away from the Torah and its way of life, and they seem to be unaware that judgment is looming on the horizon. They were so wrapped up in their own little world, they could not perceive their responsibilities towards God and towards one another or the ultimate judgment which is about to fall. And we have an assonance here, similar sounds between honorable men and multitude. Let me go back and look at that one more time. We're at verse 6. And so their honorable man are famished, their multitude parched with thirst. The honorable and the multitude. The more important people, the people of stature, the people of nobility, and then the common man, so to speak. And we have an assonance between these words. So the honorable men, kevodo, from kavod, meaning heavy or honor or glory. We use the word kavod, the glory of God, and is used of humanity and the more honorable men of a given community. So kavod, the kevodo, term for glory, indicating the glory or honorable man. And then the second word, hamono, kevodo, hamono. And so there's a similar sound here that would stick in their minds. And so it means multitude. We have two distinct groups, the more honorable and the mass, the people by the other word. So the point, the similar sound to aid in memory, the honorable men will become men of famine, nothing to eat, and the multitude will become men dried up from thirst. And so no food, no water. The two most basic mainstays of life. And so it's tempting to see here a hunger and thirst for the Word of God, because we're already told that that's what they don't know. They don't have knowledge. But it seems to be a picture of the coming Babylonian exile when the city's been cut off. Resources are cut off. They have a literal famine and lack of water, so they die from the lack of the necessities of life, which literally happened in both the Babylonian exile and in the Roman exile. And the inevitable result is Sheol. They're going to die, place of the dead. So Sheol, you'll find a lot of different ideas about Sheol out there, but scripturally speaking, as it's used in our text, it means where dead people go when they die. It's just kind of a generalized term, the place of the dead. Verse 14 also begins with therefore, which relates to the situation of verse 13, resulting in their death. So this verse uses picturesque language to depict Sheol as a great monster, making wide his throat, opening wide his mouth, and just sucking them all in. And so a very picturesque language, like a giant monster of some kind that's going to consume Jerusalem. The word for Jerusalem is not present You don't find the word Jerusalem in our text. But the use of the feminine association with these aspects of the people who will descend suggest Jerusalem. Because if you're talking about people in general, it's going to be masculine, not feminine in Hebrew. So if you got a group full of women and just one man, you're going to say B'nai Yisrael, sons, not daughters. And so because of that, we would understand that Jerusalem is indicated. And so we read, her splendor, her multitude, her noise, her exultant will all descend into Sheol. And since it's all feminine, her splendor, her multitude, her noise, and the ones that are partying all the time, exultant ones, will descend into Sheol. So an interesting note from Colin Dielich, a mouth is ascribed to the underworld. Also a nephesh, a greedy soul, in which, since nephesh is then applied by sound, sometimes to a thirst for blood, and sometimes to a simple greediness, and even as in the present passage and in Habakkuk 2:5, to the throat or swallow, which the soul opens without measure with its craving, when its craving knows no bounds. So it's like the craving opens this downfall. This desire for things opens this downfall. And that greediness causes the throat to open up, and the soul opens without measure, this downfall of our relationship with God and going into that underworld itself, is the way they're describing it for us. So some have suggested the poetical fulfillment of this picture being swallowed up in the two events that destroyed Jerusalem. And that, in a sense, they were literally swallowed up this way by the Babylonians and later by the Romans. Because in both cases, they cut off the supply of food and water. In both cases, the famine became so intense that they began to eat their children. Things got so intense, they'd do anything to survive. And so it is a possibility. I don't know that that's necessarily the right way to view it, but nonetheless, he said, yeah, this is going to get very difficult. And even the most honorable men are going to have famine, and the rest of the people are going to thirst to death, and death is coming. Sheol is going to receive them. Verses 15 and 16. So the common man will be humbled, the man of importance abased. So we keep playing with those two ideas there, from the honorable to the common. So the common man will be humbled, the man of importance abased. The eyes of the proud also will be abased. But Adonai Sevaot will be exalted in judgment. The Holy One will show himself holy in righteousness. He'll be made holy because he's going to judge sin. Because sin can't stand in the presence of a holy God. And so this, another pair of terms dealing with different levels of humanity in Judah and Jerusalem, as our New American Standard has translated it. The words common and importance are not to be found in the text. What we have is two different words for man. And so we have Adam, which would represent the first man, Adam, or to represent mankind in general. Then you have the Hebrew word ish, which means an individual human being, an individual man. So you've got mankind, individual. So as a nation and as an individual. It kind of gives you a broad view and an individual view. And so that was always true of the people of God. There's a national covenant. An individual has to give surrender to that covenant. To be truly a people of God, the nation must worship God. The individuals must worship God because they make up the nation. And so as goes the people, so goes the country. And so it takes the individuals, but it takes the nation too. Individuals make up the nation. And so when the majority of the individuals are against God, the whole nation is going to go down the tubes. And so it's both national and individual. And so rather than seeing separate kind of men, as the New American Standard translated, it would be better to represent the comprehensive nature of the situation where man has exalted himself as it were up to heaven. It's all about me. And both as a nation and as individuals within that nation. It was done on a national scale because of vast numbers of individuals live that way. All the inhabitants will be put on even footing in regards to their abandoning of God and exalting of self. So first term, humbled, comes from the verb shachak, which means to be bowed down or bend over. And so we humble ourselves under God. How do we show that we're humble? Well, A lot of different postures in prayer. When we go to pray to show our humility before God, bow the head, fold the hands, get on our knees and bow the head and fold the hands. To raise the hands and look towards glory, or to go flat out on the floor. These are different postures that shows humility. And so it comes from this idea of humbled from to be bowed down or bent over. We might envision those who are forced to bow down before the powerful enemy once conquered. And the second word, abase, comes from the word shaphael, meaning to become low, overthrow, abase, or humiliate. And so many arrogant nations, in fact, Japan used to be very bad about this during certain periods of time when they conquered somebody or they came into town to show their dominance. They would have you lay on the ground, they'd walk over your back. And so to humble it, put them on the ground and step on them, basically. And so the idea of peon comes from that, because they did more than just step on you. And I'll leave it at that. So many arrogant nations, that's what it would mean. And the expression for the nation of large, Adam, the people individually, Ish, summed up in the one word, the proud. And so they're going to be humbled. They're going to be forced to bow down. And of course, the phrase that we think of, every knee shall bow and every tongue confess, Yeshua the Messiah is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Everybody will bow one time. And before it's all over, every knee and every tongue will bow. And so, because the nation at large, Adam, the people individually, Ish, are all proud, the proud. The actual Hebrew here, gavoa, an adjective used in plural form to sum up the first two words, actually means high. It's used in the context of the sentence haughty, hence the more usual word in English is proud. So haughty in spirit. Think I'm better. Think I'm better than everybody else. I think I can take care of my own destiny, and I don't need God. That's a very haughty attitude. But Adonai will be exalted in judgment. So exaltation of the man or the exaltation of God. Exaltation of God's coming in judgment. He will be exalted in judgment. And we have the verb form of the word just used to mean high, gavah, and this is an excellent way to translate this phrase. He will be made high or lifted up or exalted through the judgment he brings upon an evil people. And so his holiness is seen through righteous judgment of those who are his people in accordance with the established covenant which he made with them at Mount Sinai, the Mosaic covenant. Holy God shows himself to be holy in righteous justice. I'm going to hold you accountable. We made a covenant. You said you would do whatever I told you, and I told you what I would do for you. God never ceased to do what he said. In spite of their obstinate, rebellious, hard heart, he kept on blessing them until it finally got to the point he said, all right, I'm done. And their pride and their arrogance brought them to that judgment. And so another long note here, I believe this one that's also from Kaladilish. God who is both exalted and holy in himself. He is an exalted and holy God, period. Demanded that as the exalted one, he should be exalted, and as the holy one, he should be sanctified. But Jerusalem had not done that. He would therefore prove himself the exalted one by the execution of justice, and sanctify himself by the manifestation of righteousness, in consequence of which the people of Jerusalem would have to give him glory against their will, as forming part of the things under the earth. Philippians 2:10 that we referred to earlier says Kala Delish. And then Dr. Oswald says what marks God off here is his righteousness and justice. Finally, it is not our limited intelligence, limited power, or limited lifespan that drags us down to humiliation before God. It's our inability to love justice and do rightly that makes a mockery of all of our pretentiousness to have ultimate meaning in ourselves. That's what marks God as truly holy. So you understand the note? So our inability to love justice and to do rightly. And so it makes a mockery of all of our own pretentiousness. I'm a good man. I don't do bad things. Why would God judge me? Well, because you don't honor him as God. That's why. So it's still a pretentiousness if we think we can live our life apart from God and find eternal state apart from him. We can't. And so it's not limited intelligence, limited power, limited lifespan that drags us down. It is our rejection of God and the rejection of his word that drags us down. We're to honor him with our voice. We're to honor him with our life. We're to honor him with our thoughts. That's the hardest one. That's the hardest one. Just get on the highway. That's a hard one. And so we have to do that. That's what this is all about. He's going to show himself righteous because he's going to hold us accountable to that which we've agreed in his word. And that means that covenant relationship. Micah 6:6 says, with what shall I come to Adonai and bow myself before the God on high? Shall I come to him with burnt offerings, with yearling calves? Does Adonai take delight in thousands of rams and 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I present my firstborn for my rebellious acts, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? Shall I sacrifice my firstborn son? He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and love kindness and walk humbly before your God? And so if we're going to lift ourselves up, he's going to bring us down. And so pride goeth before a fall. The word for kindness in the last verse in this Micah translation is the Hebrew chesed, which in this context suggests loyalty. Part of what our love for God brings is loyalty. He expects a loyalty to his word and a loyalty to his person out of those who are his children, to be loyal to him. And that's the whole idea of accusing them of spiritual adultery. You were not loyal to me. You went after this and you went after that as if that was going to give you eternal life. Or all right, go after this, after that, as if that was going to cause your ground to produce better. Or after this god or that goddess. No. Loyalty. And just as there's a loyalty in that sense of ancient Israel, there's a loyalty for us today. Coming after this typical expression of love from man, ahav, there is what does God require of you? Do justice, love kindness, love chesed, ahav chesed, love loyalty, love God above all other things. Which brings us then to verse 17. Then the lambs will graze as in their pasture, and strangers will eat in the waste places of the wealthy. So when they're judged, all that they built, all of those fine houses and all those large estates that they built, it's going to be a place for the lambs to graze and strangers to hang out and eat their feed. And so it projects the peace that will be found in Judah and Jerusalem when all of the grandeur of the homes, the lands have been destroyed. And all that's left will be turned into grazing ground. And so Buxbaum put it this way: the once beautiful, cultivated, rich land now ravaged by the enemy will become an cultivated heath, just the growth of whatever grows there, where stray lambs shall graze and roaming strangers shall scavenge in the land which was once so rich and prosperous. So whether it means goats and lambs and the people wandering in, or is it the lambs wandering in, really doesn't matter. Israel's gone. There's nothing but shambles left, and the wild animals are coming in. And the following note from Colin Dietrich, I wanted to put this in here. As I was speaking last night and I was preparing for Isaiah, this just struck me. At the end of last night's message, I was talking about the fact that most people don't think Babylon could be rebuilt. And they didn't think Israel could be rebuilt either. And so Colin Dietrich were writing in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So late 1890s, 1880s, 90s, maybe up to about 1900 in their commentary. And so this note portrays the reality of the statement that existed prior to the Reformation of the nation in 1948. So they wrote and ministered in a very previous time. So here's their note. When we consider that the Holy Land is at this present time, when they wrote, an extensive pasture ground for Arab shepherds, and that modern Jerusalem, which has arisen from the dust, is a Mohammedan city, we may see this also as a literal fulfillment of verse 17. And so it once was. And so it's very interesting. They said the Arabs would come in. They'd had their camels and their goats that would eat the fresh, new little trees growing up. So they'd eat the little palm trees, they'd eat the little fruit trees and destroy all the trees around. And so, and the time that Mark Twain toured the land and wrote his little poem about how stark it was, how lack of growth there was, compared to what it is today is like difference between dark and light. But at that time, that's what it looked like. And because most people, that's all they could see is an Arab-run area. It was Arab-run under British domination until the time that they became a nation again. So after World War I, it was British. The whole land of Israel was British controlled until the time of May of 1948. The Balfour Declaration was turned around. So that's the way they used to see it. And people didn't think Israel could possibly ever be built again. But it was. Verses 18 and 19, what are those who drag iniquity with the cords of falsehood and sin as if with cart ropes? And so the idea here is they're yoked together with sin. And who say, let him make speed, let him hasten his work that we may see it. Let God do what he says. Let the purpose of the Holy One of Israel draw near and come to pass that we may know it. And so they were saying it flippantly. So the two verses read like an arrogant, high-handed sinner's challenge to God to reveal himself. But he's going to do that. The Holy One will draw near, and it will come to pass, and we will see and know that he truly is who he says he is. The two verses are formally part of the next section, verses 18 through 25, and reflect an obstinate, defiant people who refuse to live in accordance with God's covenant, the Torah, and similarly reflect the people who doubt God's involvement in the normal day-to-day life and activities of the people of Judah and Jerusalem. And some suggest that this statement here in 18 and 19, who say, let him make speed, let him hasten his work, if he's going to do all this stuff, that this is a response to verse 12. Their banquets are accompanied by lyre and harp, by tambourine and flute and wine, but they do not pay attention to the deeds of Adonai, nor do they consider the work of his hands. And so they're saying in response to Isaiah here, some suggest, well, let him make speed, let him hasten his work. We can see it. Let him come do it. And to challenge God that way is a very dangerous thing to do. They drag the iniquity with cords. It's very interesting. It's ha-avon, the iniquity. So what was the iniquity? Was that something more than just their sins? So you got two words here. You've got the word avon, which comes from the verb form, means to bend, to twist, to distort, thus giving the rise to pervert the truth, that which is real, genuine, and righteous. So pervertedness, if you will. It just typically is translated iniquity, which is not a bad translation, but the idea of iniquity is I make the Torah fit the way I want it to. I turn it to make it good for me. And so I twist, distort the Word of God. The noun which we have in our text, typically iniquity or guilt. And then the following word is the word for sin, chata, to miss the mark. But the use of this definite article in avon, the iniquity, and ropes of the cart calls for explanation, according to Dr. Watts. Can it be that these are references to a diabolical deity or an idol that cannot be named, whose cult, like that of India's juggernaut, pulls its decorated cart through the streets? Notice they did make a declaration, just a question here. Or is the verse to be taken at face value to picture figuratively those who strain to further the cause of evil and tirelessly work to promote sin? We got a number of people doing that in America today, don't we? Promoting their sin and doing everything they can to promote it. Or is the phrase, the cords of nothingness, a reference to the knotted cords used in magic to effect curses on enemies? And so if these were real things, and Dr. Watt simply says these woes hit it much more than what it says. So there could be behind this little phraseology, the iniquity. Could be an idolatrous thing that they were following after. And these expressions at very least reveal a people proud of their unbelieving ways. And this unbelief then yoked them to iniquity and to sin, and following after them was the sure punishment for this kind of obstinate behavior, even if they remain unaware of the reality of the punishment that's coming. So they taunt God. So relevant in our days when those living in open debauchery and threaten, they are coming for the children. So one of the latest little LGBTQ parades, they literally said out loud, it's been recorded, we're coming for your children. So taunt, decry, and challenge God. Well, so glad we're not part of that group. But you and I best be careful that we don't challenge God in any way. Very dangerous stance for anyone to so taunt and speak against him. In our text, they call upon God to work his work, for him to display his holiness so they might experience his presence and his judgment. Well, he will bring it to them. It's an expression of denial and rejection. They taunt because they don't believe he's real or that he will show up, or don't believe he'll show up and do anything to prevent their ongoing lifestyle. Jeremiah 17:15, he said, look, they keep saying to me, where is the word of the Lord? Let it come now. So it's not a new statement. Amos 5:18 through 20, alas, you who are longing for the day of the Lord, for what purpose will the day of the Lord be to you? It will be darkness and not light. That's when a man flees from a lion or a bear meets him, or goes home, leans against his hand against the wall, and a snake bites him. Will not the day of the Lord be darkness instead of light, even gloom with no brightness in it? So Amos is saying there's a lot of people want to hasten the day of the Lord when they're not right with God and ready for him to come. So it's a very serious thing to taunt the true and living God. There'll be a certain and complete judgment for insolence against their Creator. And so you and I, and when I think about the coming day of the Lord, we need to be careful that we don't hasten a day that we're not prepared ourselves for fully. We need to carefully prepare our hearts, souls, minds, and lifestyles to meet our Maker and come before the judgment seat of Messiah. 2 Corinthians 5:10 says, for we must all appear before the judgment seat of Messiah, so that each one may be recompensed for his deeds in the body according to what he has done, whether good or bad. So we're not in the same boat that these guys are in. Isaiah is condemning a nation who was belligerent of God, denying God, rejecting him, fighting against God. And the judgment was about to come. He's talking about that Babylonian judgment ultimately. Here in Isaiah, Jeremiah goes to greater extent with and tells us when the Babylonian judgment hit. But Isaiah is talking about it before the days of Jeremiah. And so I had a question one night not long ago. Isaiah, he functioned from Uzziah up through Hezekiah. After Hezekiah was Manasseh. After Manasseh, Josiah. And Josiah was the good king under which Jeremiah began his ministry. So you've got maybe a generation between Isaiah and Jeremiah. And Isaiah prophesied a much larger time frame than even Jeremiah did. As we get through all of Isaiah, we'll see how far he predicted things well in advance, prophesied according to the Spirit's guidance, and gave us a beautiful, wonderful, picturesque of our coming Messiah and what it's going to look like. Well, let me end with that, quit rambling, and see if we can questions or comments today.